They called it medicine, but it was revenge. The deadliest weapon on the plantation wasn't forged in steel. It grew in the garden. Charleston, South Carolina, 1769. A slave woman named Lucy stands trial for murder. The courtroom is packed with white planters, merchants, and overseers. Lucy sits in chains, her face unreadable, her hands steady. The prosecutor holds up a small clay bowl. He claims Lucy served her master soup laced with poison. The master died within hours, convulsing and screaming. No one could prove what killed him, but the planters knew. They had always known. Across the American South, plantation owners are dying under mysterious circumstances. Sudden fevers, violen seizures, unexplained paralysis. Doctors diagnose natural causes, but the patterns are unmistakable. Slaves who cook, clean, and tend gardens are watching their masters closely. They know which plants heal and which plants kill. This knowledge traveled with them from West Africa. In their homelands, they were herbalists, healers, and spiritual leaders. They understood the power of roots, leaves, and seeds. Now, in bondage, that knowledge becomes a weapon. Enslaved Africans recognize plants that white colonists ignore completely. Oleander grows wild along plantation fences, beautiful and deadly. A single leaf, ground into powder, stops a heart. Jimson weed sprouts in fields, its seeds causing hallucinations and death. Pokeweed berries look harmless, but destroy internal organs slowly. White snake root, when fed to cows, poisons their milk. Masters drink the milk and die without anyone suspecting the source. Enslaved women work in kitchens, gardens, and sick rooms. They prepare meals, brew teas, and mix medicines. They have access to everything their masters consume, and they have every reason to use it. Knowledge spreads quietly through slave quarters. At night, elders teach younger women which plants to avoid and which to remember. They pass information through songs, stories, and whispered conversations. No written records exist because most slaves cannot read or write, but the knowledge survives, coded and protected. A mother tells her daughter that root heals fever in small doses. She pauses, then adds, "In large doses, it stops breathing." The daughter nods and remembers. This is not random violence or desperate rage. This is a strategy, passed down and carefully executed. Virginia, 1755. An enslaved cook named Eve prepares dinner for her master's family. She moves through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, chopping vegetables and stirring pots. Her master has just sold her to children to a trader. She watched them dragged away in chains 3 days ago. Tonight, she adds a new ingredient to the master's stew, ground seeds from a plant she cultivated in the kitchen garden. The family eats together, laughing and talking. Within an hour, the master clutches his stomach and collapses. His wife screams for help, but he dies before morning. The doctor declares it a sudden illness, possibly spoiled meat. Eve is questioned, but shows no emotion, no guilt, no fear. She is never charged. Plantation owners begin to suspect their slaves. They issue new rules. Slaves cannot grow their own gardens. They cannot prepare food without white supervision. They cannot gather herbs or roots without permission. But enforcement is impossible. Plantations are too large, slaves too numerous, and masters too dependent. Who will cook if not the slaves? Who will tend the sick if not the slave midwives and herbalists? The masters need the very people they fear, and the slaves know it. South Carolina, 1761. A planter named Thomas drowns his slaves' crops and destroys their garden plots. He suspects them of cultivating poison plants. The slaves replant in hidden clearings deep in the woods. They forage along river banks and in swamps where overseers won't follow. Thomas hires a white cook to replace his enslaved kitchen staff. The white cook knows nothing about southern plants or African methods. Within weeks, Thomas falls ill with symptoms no doctor can explain. He dies slowly in agony over 3 weeks. The white cook is blamed for negligence and incompetence. The enslaved workers return to the kitchen. Colonial courts tried dozens of slaves for suspected poisoning. Most cases lack evidence because poison is invisible and untraceable. Prosecutors rely on confessions extracted through torture. Some slaves confess to save others from punishment. Some confess because they know they will die regardless. Lucy, in Charleston, refuses to confess. She insists she served her master only what he requested. The jury convicts her anyway based on suspicion and fear. She is hanged in the public square as a warning. Hundreds of slaves are forced to watch. But the executions do not stop the poisonings. Legislatures across the South pass harsh new laws. Slaves caught with medicinal plants face whipping or execution. Slaves who practice healing without white supervision are imprisoned. Teaching other slaves about plants becomes a capital crime. Slave patrols increase inspections of quarters, searching for hidden herbs, but the knowledge cannot be erased. It lives in memory, passed mother to daughter, elder to apprentice, and the deaths continue. Louisiana, 1773. An enslaved woman named Marie is known as a healer. Other slaves come to her for remedies when they fall sick. Her master's wife also consults her, trusting Marie's knowledge over white doctors. Marie's master dies. Suddenly after drinking the tea, Marie prepared. His wife, grieving and furious, accuses Marie of murder. Marie is arrested and tortured for 3 days. She refuses to confess or name anyone else. Other slaves fear they will be implicated and avoid her completely. Marie is burned alive in front of the plantation community. Her knowledge dies with her, but others continue in secret. Enslaved communities adapt their methods. They become more cautious, more patient, more strategic. Poisonings become slower, harder to detect, and easier to disguise as natural illness. Symptoms mimic common diseases, fevers, digestive problems, and heart failure. Doctors attribute deaths to the harsh southern climate and poor sanitation. They never suspect the food, the water, or the medicine. Slaves continue working in kitchens, gardens, and sick rooms. They smile, obey, and serve and they wait. Knowledge networks expand beyond individual plantations. Enslaved people share information during Sunday gatherings and market days. Traveling slaves carry messages between communities. They warn each other about new laws and increase patrols. They share which plants are safest and which methods attract the least suspicion. This is resistance without armies, without weapons, without open rebellion. This is survival through knowledge, patience, and invisible power. By the 1780s, colonial newspapers reported epidemic levels of mysterious deaths among slaveholders. Some planters hire food tasters, forcing slaves to eat first. Enslaved cooks comply, then adjust their methods. They poison water sources, bedding, or clothing instead. They use plants that absorb through the skin or release toxins slowly over time. Masters grow paranoid, trusting no one. Some abandon their plantations entirely, fleeing to cities. But even in cities, they employ enslaved servants. The threat follows them everywhere. Georgia, 1791. A plantation owner named William dismisses all his enslaved household staff. He hires only white servants and cooks. Within months, his crops fail because he lacks experienced field workers. His household falls into chaos because white servants refuse hard labor. He rehires his former slaves out of desperation. 3 months later, William dies in his sleep. The doctor ruled it heart failure. His slaves inherit nothing, but they survive. They continue working for William's widow, and they remember everything. The poisonings never stop. They continue through the Revolutionary War into the 1800s, beyond abolition. Records are incomplete because slaveholders destroy evidence of their vulnerability. They cannot admit their slaves hold power over life and death. They cannot acknowledge their dependence on people they claim to own. So the deaths are recorded as accidents, illnesses, and natural causes. But the slaves know the truth, and they pass it down. The knowledge becomes more dangerous as slavery expands westward. New territories mean new plantations, new masters, and new opportunities. Enslaved people carry seeds hidden in their hair, sewn into clothing, buried in small pouches. They replant their gardens in unfamiliar soil. They test local plants, experimenting carefully to learn which ones kill. The resistance adapts to every new landscape. Mississippi Territory, 1799. Territorial governors create specialized slave courts to prosecute poisoning cases. These courts operate without juries, using only white magistrates. Accusations alone are enough for conviction. Proof is unnecessary when fear drives the law. Enslaved defendants have no right to testify or call witnesses. Confessions extracted under torture are accepted as evidence. Executions increase, but the poisonings do not stop. A white physician named Dr. Harrison begins studying the mysterious deaths. He examines bodies, questions symptoms, and reviews medical records. He notices patterns: sudden paralysis, Biolan convulsions, unexplained organ failure. These symptoms do not match known diseases. Harrison suspects poison but cannot identify the source. He approaches several plantation owners with his findings. They refuse to cooperate, fearing public panic and economic collapse. Admitting vulnerability means admitting slaves have power. Harrison publishes his findings in a medical journal anyway. The article is suppressed within weeks. Plantation owners pressure the publisher to retract it completely. The journal burns every remaining copy. State legislatures pass increasingly brutal laws targeting enslaved healers. Any slave found with medicinal plants faces mandatory execution. Teaching healing practices becomes punishable by death. Slave patrols conduct random searches, destroying herb gardens and confiscating supplies. But the laws cannot stop knowledge that exists only in memory. New Orleans, 1805. Enslaved people gather at the Sunday market to sell vegetables and crafts. This is one of the few spaces where they can move semi-freely. Information travels through coded conversations and subtle gestures. A woman selling herbs mentions that yellow root is growing well this season. Another woman nods and asks where she found such good quality. They are not discussing gardening. They are sharing which poison is currently undetectable and effective. White observers see only innocent commerce. The network operates in plain sight. Alabama, 1812. An enslaved man named Peter is caught stealing food from the smokehouse. His punishment, 50 lashes, will provide information about slave activities. Peter chooses information, revealing the names of people who gather herbs. He identifies 3 women as suspected poisoners. The women are arrested immediately, interrogated, and tortured. 1 woman dies during questioning without confessing. The other 2 are hanged publicly. Peter receives extra food rations as a reward. Other slaves avoid him completely, marking him as a traitor. 3 months later, Peter dies from what appears to be food poisoning. No investigation follows. The poisonings evolve into a form of invisible warfare. Enslaved people target not just brutal masters, but also slave traders and overseers. They poison the men who separate families and auction children. A slave trader in Richmond falls ill after every market day. He cannot identify the source, but grows weaker each month. Eventually, he sells his business and leaves the state. Another trader in Charleston dies suddenly, his body covered in mysterious sores. The pattern repeats across the South. Plantation owners hire chemists to test their food and water. These early toxicologists had limited tools and knowledge. They can identify arsenic and mercury, but not plant-based poisons. Enslaved cooks adapt immediately, abandoning metals entirely. They use only organic compounds that leave no chemical trace. The chemists find nothing and declare the food safe. Masters eat confidently, and some still die. Elderly enslaved women become the most valuable targets for suppression. These women hold decades of accumulated knowledge about plants, dosages, and methods. Slave patrols specifically hunt for gatherings where elders teach younger women, but the teaching continues in fields, during work, in whispered moments. A grandmother picks cotton alongside her granddaughter. She points to a weed growing between the rows. "That one makes sleep come forever," she says quietly. The granddaughter memorizes the shape of the leaves. This education happens every day, invisibly, unstoppably. Tennessee, 1820. A house slave named Sarah gains her master's complete trust. She nurses him through illness, prepares his meals, and manages his household. He promises Sarah freedom in his will as a reward for her loyalty. Sarah waits patiently for 15 years. The master changes his will, leaving Sarah to his son instead. Sarah learns of this change when the master brags about it at dinner. 2 weeks later, the master dies peacefully in his sleep. The doctor attributes it to old age. Sarah is sold to the son, who moves her to a distant plantation. She teaches the slaves there everything she knows. By the 1830s, some plantation owners had abandoned traditional slave management entirely. They hire white overseers to supervise every aspect of slave life. They import white cooks and household staff from Europe. They isolate their enslaved workers from gardens, kitchens, and medicine. These plantations operate like prisons, with constant surveillance and control. Production drops because enslaved people work more slowly under such conditions. Profits decline, and owners cannot sustain the expensive white staff. Within a few years, they return to the old system, and the cycle begins again. As slavery expands into Texas and Arkansas, the resistance follows. Enslaved people identify new plants in these regions. They test, experiment, and share results through underground networks. Texas settlers report unusual deaths among slaveholders. Territorial authorities blame disease, climate, and poor water quality. They never suspect the enslaved people clearing land and building homes. The knowledge adapts to every environment, every climate, every region. Southern states created Negro courts specifically for poisoning accusations. These courts have no appeals process and no oversight. Accused slaves are tried, convicted, and executed within days. Between 1835 and 1842, over 200 enslaved people were executed for suspected poisoning. As convictions rely on and testimony from other slaves coerced through torture. The executions are public spectacles designed to terrorize slave communities, but the poisonings continue. Plantation records from this period show careful omissions. Deaths are recorded as natural causes, sudden illness, or unknown fever. No planter admits losing control or living in fear. No newspaper reports the true scale of poisonings. The conspiracy of silence protects white authority and white dignity. But enslaved people know exactly what is happening. They count the deaths, remember the names, and pass down the stories. Resistance through poison comes at an enormous cost. Hundreds of enslaved people are executed on mere suspicion. Thousands more are tortured, maimed, or sold away from their families. Communities are torn apart by accusations and betrayals. But the resistance never stops, because the alternative is accepting total powerlessness. This is survival by any means necessary. Georgia, 1848. An elderly woman named Mama June gathers young girls around her cabin. She is teaching them to identify plants in the forest. She shows them roots that heal wounds and leaves that stop pain. Then she shows them the other plants. This one, she says, holding up a small white flower, ends suffering permanently. She does not elaborate, but the girls understand. One girl asks if using such plants is wrong. Mama June looks at her steadily. Is it wrong to protect yourself from a wolf? She asks. The girl shakes her head. Then remember what I taught you, Mama June says. 6 months later, Mama June dies. Her knowledge continues through the girls she taught. By 1850, the knowledge network spanned the entire South. Information travels through markets, church gatherings, and traveling slaves. Methods are refined, dosages perfected, detection avoided. This is not random violence, but organized, strategic resistance. It operates without leaders, without documentation, without central coordination. It survives because it exists in memory, passed person to person. No law can legislate memory. No patrol can search inside human minds. White doctors continue publishing theories about southern diseases. They blame swamp air, bad water, and a tropical climate. They create elaborate medical explanations for symptoms they cannot understand. They never consider that enslaved people possess knowledge that whites do not have. To admit this would undermine the entire justification for slavery. How can an inferior race outsmart their superior masters? The question cannot be asked, so the truth remains hidden. The Civil War began in 1860. Plantation systems collapse as Union armies advance. Enslaved people flee to freedom, carrying their knowledge with them. Some use it to survive in refugee camps and contraband communities. Others teach it to their children as history and protection. The knowledge that was once resistance becomes heritage. It survives Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and beyond. Even after emancipation, the deaths are never investigated. No records document how many slaveholders died from poison. No trials acknowledge the organized nature of the resistance. History records slavery as a system of complete domination. It ignores the invisible warfare enslaved people waged every day. The poisonings are forgotten, dismissed, or denied. But the descendants remember. The deadliest weapon was never visible. It grew in gardens, forests, and fields. It was carried in memory, passed through whispers, hidden in plain sight. Enslaved people could not fight armies or change laws, but they could choose who lived and who died. They could make their masters fear the food they ate. They could prove that ownership was never absolute. Power existed even in the most powerless positions, and that power was never surrendered.